Medea, one thing I don't think a lot of Americans really understand is the impact of sanctions and, what that does to other countries. We obviously know how devastating they've been, in particular to Venezuela. Can you talk about how that is a new form of warfare that maybe people don't fully understand?
Well, that's right. And it's a form of warfare that is not new to the United States. Some of the older folks listening might remember when the U.S. had these devastating sanctions on Iraq before the U.S. invasion. That was in the 90s, that killed hundreds of thousands. And there was the famous quote by Secretary of State Madeleine Albright at the time when she was asked if the death of 500,000 children was worth it. And she said, yes.
Yes.
So it was brutal sanctions against Iraq. But it's been under the Trump administration that these sanctions have really proliferated to the extent that about a third of humanity is under some form of U.S. sanctions. And the worst ones are Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, but they extend. And of course, the big one would be China, which the U.S. has sanctions on, but not the same kind of sanctions. They're much more limited. The kind of sanctions we see against the countries that I first mentioned are unilateral sanctions that have extraterritorial reach, because they say that not only can't U.S. companies trade with these countries, but we don't want any other countries or companies to trade with them. And so they are particularly brutal, and they're only can happen because the U.S. is so strong. And it's this idea of might makes right. Because we can do it, we will do it. And the result has been horrific. We see reports by the UN that had talked about over 100,000 people in Venezuela died because of these sanctions. I've been to Iran several times and know how hard it is, particularly now under this pandemic, to get the kind of medicines that they need. They starve the countries themselves from getting income, exporting their goods, and then those countries don't have the resources to support their people. And then the U.S. turns around and say, look what a mess Cuba's in, what a mess Venezuela's in.
It's socialism. It's socialism.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's very, very brutal. And it is, as you said, a kind of warfare. It might not be the one with the guns and the bombs, but it kills people nonetheless.
Can you talk about, and I try to emphasize this as often as I can, I think independent media is growing exponentially in a good way, but the power of corporate media is still very real. And, when they want to sell something like
regime change in Venezuela.
I mean, I was inadvertently listening to CNN for maybe 5 minutes.
Don't do that.
And even with Trump exiting, they're trying to tell him, oh, he's not hard enough on Iran. And I'm just thinking, there are millions of people who hear this and they believe this. Yeah. That's the scary thing. Can you talk about the impact still of corporate media and how it's still maybe not as effective as 2003 selling the war in Iraq, but nonetheless their ability to still sell
manufacturing is their strong suit.
Yep.
Well, that's right. And sensationalism is as well. So they have these one-sided views. And when I see who they bring on the talk shows, like the Sunday talk shows, if they're talking about Iran, they'll never bring on somebody from the Iranian government.
They don't invite you to come on? Do they invite you to come on and talk about these things?
They don't. And, I used to, under Obama, get invited on Fox News because we were one of the progressive groups that were critical of Obama for a lot of his foreign policy. Yeah. And, they love that. Anybody who's critical of Obama got a voice. But couldn't get on CNN. And I heard that I was banned from MSNBC, which is strange, because they do have some good progressives on there, but not so much on the foreign policy front. And then It was funny. I got a call about 2 weeks ago from PBS that they were impressed with the campaign we had around Michelle Flournoy, and said that they might want me on. They said, but we're very concerned about you getting it on because we once had you on, and this was back in 2014. And when we pre-interviewed you, you sounded very rational and very calm and like a think tank kind of person. And then when you came on, you were like an activist. And we don't want that to happen again. Can you guarantee us that that won't happen? And it's funny, I went back and I Googled my name in PBS and I found the segment, and I was totally rational. I was actually quite calm as well. But to think that that was just too much for them is really sad. So yes, the views we get in the mainstream media tend to be ones from hawkish think tanks. And if you're going to talk about the Middle East, it seems a criteria is that you had to have supported the worst foreign policy blunder in modern U.S. history, which was the war in Iraq, that somehow makes you an expert. And so we even see people like Colin Powell, Secretary of State under Bush, that was the one who went before the United Nations and lied. That really was the icing on the cake that got us into the war in Iraq.
Oh, because he's trustworthy.
He's now been rehabilitated on places like CNN to be coming on and saying how awful Trump is and how Trump has to be held accountable, but nothing about accountability for dragging us into a war on the basis of lies.
I just wanted to say something. We were talking about sanctions, that I don't think that people understand the reason behind that, like why they do that. I mean, I think there's this thought by the powers that be that if you starve out the people, they will rise up and they will overturn their own, right? Like they are going to be so frustrated with their lot in life but that's not how it happens. And basically we just punish the poor people.
Well, that's right. And it's portrayed to the American public as an alternative to war. But really, it is designed for regime change, just like a war would be. And when you see how those sanctions have not led to the overthrow of the Cuban government in 60 years, that's why Obama said, let's try something different. It's not that they didn't want regime change. They said, well, let's try it from a different way with, quote, soft power. And then in the case of Iran, it's also interesting because I know a lot of people who hate the Iranian government, and they don't want to live in a theocracy. They want a more progressive secular government, and I surely can understand that. But they look around the region and they say, if we look at where the U.S. has intervened, it's worse. It's absolute chaos and total destruction, whether it's Iraq, Libya, Syria. And they say, we don't want that for our country. So we're better sticking with the horrible government we have than welcoming the United States to bomb our country, overthrow our government, and try to impose a government that nobody will be accepting of. And it'll turn into division and chaos. And maybe that's what the United States wants.
Medea, we have an interesting question from a gentleman named Dustin Price. He says, I've leaned on the sanctions are actually warfare against civilians, but are there good sanctions? Is there such thing as good sanctions?
Yes, it's a very good question. And, I tried to start that by saying that there are a third of humanity is under some kind of sanctions, but they're not all these sanctions that are collective punishment against an entire population. There are good sanctions, and good sanctions can be against narco traffickers. They can be against human rights abusers. They can be against government officials who are responsible for violently repressing protesters. We have been calling for sanctions on Saudi Arabia, not only for its disgusting war in Yemen and the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, but also for the internal repression. And there have been no sanctions put on Saudi Arabia, just the contrary. There are sanctions that would stop the US from training officers of those countries, which could be a good thing. There are sanctions that would stop US sales of certain weapons to certain countries. That would be a good thing. So yes, it's a great question, and there are good sanctions.
Right, just not consumer goods that hurt people and medicine and all the things that people need. I mean, I think that the key is, who are you hurting? And when you follow the trail and you're hurting regular people, then that's not good.
That's right. Any sanctions that affect the entire population are not good.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.